Hello everybody, CVH here, and today we have another first impressions video for Return to Clockwork City, the upcoming Elder Scrolls Legends expansion coming on November 30th. A few new cards have been previewed over the last week, and in the first impressions series I like to take a look at them without having too much time to think about them since that we've seen them previewed, and just give my first impressions if I think they're good, if I think they're bad, pros and cons, if I think they fit into existing meta decks, or maybe will help to create some decks along with the other new cards in the expansion. These cards we haven't seen for too long, so obviously we'll still have a lot to think about as cards continue to get previewed, but let's get started and talk about some new cards. But first, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Messinar, one of the cards that has been previewed over the last week. This one was actually revealed by me, so if you want to see my first impressions on Messinar, I'm not going to talk about them too much here, even though he's a very cool card. You can go back and check the entire card reveal video a few videos back. I talk about this card pretty much in depth, how it works, and where it might fit in the future. Definitely recommend you check that out, and thanks again to Bethesda for letting me preview this card. Besides Messinar, we only have 4 other new cards to talk about in today's video. I like to keep them short and sweet, so I don't ramble on for too long, but let's get right into them. The first card to discuss is Star-Sung Bard. As you can see in front of you, it's a 3 Magicka neutral creature with 2 attack, 3 health, and ongoing, immune to silence. Your unique cards cost 1 less. So, interesting effect. We've seen some immunity to silence before with cards like Loot and Keeper of Whispers. This is an interesting card though, not only for that, but also the unique cards costing 1 less. The first real synergy card we've seen for unique legendaries like High King Emmerich, Red Brahmin. I've seen a few people already start brainstorming about where this card could potentially fit in, and one of the decks people have mentioned is maybe support Control Mage, because there's a lot of unique supports like Goldbrand, Orb of Vermina, and Wabbajack. This card could potentially make those cost less. I'm not super sold on this card. I'm not sure how many decks there are out there currently that really play that many unique legendaries. I like the immunity to silence. I like seeing that on cards. I think it's kind of a cool thing to implement because people can often think that silence is potentially overpowered. One of the things that's interesting about this card isn't so much relating to the power level, but it's the ongoing tag that we can see right under its picture. That's usually only seen on support cards. For example, Mundustone is an ongoing support instead of a support with activations. Now, this could actually just be maybe a typo or something. We've seen a couple cards that were previewed, then change in the preview article because they just put the wrong version up there. But maybe they are going to use ongoing as another tag that they can not only use on supports, but also on creatures with ongoing effects. You know, as long as this card is on the board, your unique cards cost 1 less. That technically is ongoing. I didn't know they were going to start adding that tag to the cards, as opposed to activated creature abilities or summon creature abilities. Kind of interesting there. Ongoing creature might be the first of its kind. We might see that retroactively applied to some of the creatures that currently exist in the game. As a card itself, I think it's interesting, but not super powerful on first glance. Next up, we have Memory Wraith, and if you guys will excuse me, I'm going to be a bit of a wet blanket here. So first of all, there's been a lot of discussion about this card, probably the most talked about of the revealed cards so far from this week and last week combined. And that's just because a lot of people really dislike Solitaire, and a lot of people have really not had the most fun playing against Ram Scout in the last 4 or so months. And I can understand these emotions. We're all waiting for, you know, more answers against Scout, even though it's not really, I would call, an overpowered deck. Direwolf did release their dev talk where they said Scout had a 48% win rate or so over the largest of sample sizes. So, even though that's been said, it is a pretty unfun deck to lose to, and a lot of the reason is because it does some crazy discard pile shenanigans that very few other strong decks really take advantage of, like Scout. The 3 copies of Solitaire and the Parthenax potentially even looping them, a lot of them still play Skeletal Dragons, so there's that. But I want to just go on record and say that I don't think this card is that good, but I also want to cover my bases and say it definitely could be good if there are way more decks in the future that are top tier that really take advantage of the discard pile. Depending on what they release in this expansion, this card could even be great as soon as the expansion releases. But no, I don't really think item decks during the Sovngarde decks are quite part of the metagame enough to justify this card. Now, a lot of people are going to say, but CVH, it's a 5-cost 5/5. I know, at worst it is a 5-cost 5/5, and at worst, a 5-cost 5/5 is not the worst, right? But in Constructed, I think people are vastly overestimating the value of 5-cost 5/5. It's easy to look at Thief of Dreams, well, not the current Thief of Dreams, but back when it was a 5/5, which it was before it got nerfed to a 4/4, and everyone would say, oh, CVH, everyone who played Thief of Dreams before it was nerfed to a 4/4. Clearly 5-cost 5/5s are good. The difference, though, is that Thief of Dreams in every single matchup gave you information on what your opponents had in their hand, And in most of the time, you could make this over 50%. Even a shot in the dark was 50%. It would give you an extra card, but more than 50% if you were actually trying to make reads on what your opponent could possibly have, it was just giving you a free extra card. That's pretty insane, coupled with the inherent value of knowing what your opponent has. If you guess wrong, you still get that information. So Thief of Dreams, way better than Memory Wraith the majority of the time. In the Direwolf Dev Talk, which if I remember, I'll probably link that in the description down there as well, they mentioned Scout was something around, I think they said 16.5% of the meta, 16 or so percent of the metagame. So if we say all of those are ramp scouts, which is already kind of a stretch, and if we just add on 10% to like maybe item decks and during the Sovngarde decks, we can say Memory Wraith will have text in around 25-26% of your games. Every single other game, 75% of the games you queue against, unless the meta significantly changes to where discard pile-centric decks are way more relevant, 75% of games, this is going to be a blue-tusked bristleback. And contrary to what a lot of people seem to think, no, you really don't want a blue-tusked bristleback in a lot of your decks. Thief of Dreams was a tusked bristleback that gave you information and drew you a card. I think Banish is definitely a sick kind of mechanic to introduce into Legends, and I think in the future there are cards with Banish that could be very good. I'm just not particularly sold on this one due to how narrow it is. So in Control Mage, you are playing a tusked bristleback in 75% of your matchups, and let's say in that 25 remaining percent, this card increases your win rate. Does it increase your win rate enough, A, to make up for the other 75% of matchups having a significantly worse card in your deck, or B, increase the win rate enough to actually make those matchups favorable anyway? If I'm still going to lose to Ram Scout 80%, well, not 80% of the time, but if I'm still playing Control Mage against Ram Scout and still going to lose the majority of the time, even with this card, is the difference in making the matchup go from abysmal to terrible, which I guess is better than abysmal, is that difference worth playing a vanilla creature in so many other matchups? And then everyone turns to me and they say, well, you can just play it in a curve-based deck. Play it in one of those intelligence-using mid-range decks, like mid-range Sorcerer, mid-range Assassin. But those decks already beat decks like Ram Scout. And this card really only prevents Soul Tear on the turns immediately following Memory Wraiths being played. So ideally in a curve deck, you're playing your 5-drop on turn 5 and your goal is to pressure. I can pressure better with Hoffing a Marauder, Whiterun Protector, or Cliff Racer. If I play those cards, my opponent's still not going to theoretically be able to Soul Tear me the following turn because they're going to be spending 3 Magicka to do nothing. So those decks simply have a different game plan, and they don't really care about Soul Tear. I don't remember a time when I was playing a mid-range deck and my opponent played a turn 5 Soul Tear that I lost that game. You know, you're worried about the Thorn Hist Mages and the Leaf Lurkers and defensive options at that point, not so much the value. So I think this card is really, really cool. Obviously in Arena, it's fine for just being a 5-cost 5/5. That's totally reasonable, even though you're not really going to get too much value out of the effect in Arena. In Constructed, I just think it's a bit too narrow. I think the decks that really need a card like this suffer too much from having a 5-cost 5/5 that doesn't do anything else or have any sort of versatility or utility outside of those matchups. And I think the decks that it could fit in well, like the mid-range curve decks, simply already beat the decks that this card is really narrowly trying to counter, and there are just better 5-drops out there. But I think the card, and I think Banish in general, is a really welcome inclusion in Legends. But no, to summarize, I do not think this card is going to be nerfed. I've already seen people thinking this card is going to be nerfed, and I was over here like, what? I don't think this is that good. All right, let's move on. The next card is Brasilisk. Now this card is pretty cool and has obvious shades of a Hearthstone card. I try not to mention too many Hearthstone cards, but the comparison here is just too easy. Grim Patron. People loved Patron Warrior, or hated Patron Warrior, depending on how good you were at the deck, basically. So this is a 3-cost 2/2 in Endurance. When Brasilisk takes damage and survives, summon a copy of it in the other lane. So while it is similar to Grim Patron, there are some differences. It costs less. That's a plus. It has less stats. That's a definite minus for obvious reasons. You'd rather have more stats on any creature, basically, and also because this card's effect needs it to take damage to get any true value out of it. Also, since we have the 2-lane system in Legends and Hearthstone only has the 1 game board, this card summoning a copy of itself in the other lane could also be seen as like kind of an interesting development there. I don't know if that's actually going to be a positive or a negative a lot of the time. I could see situations where you'd want it in the same lane. I basically don't have a whole lot of control over where the copy goes. Maybe it would be cool if you could choose where the copy goes. But my main problem with this card at the moment is while I really, really want it to be good, I'm worried that only having 2 health is pretty much going to kill this card's combo potential unless you play a lot of cards that can buff the health. Maybe I'm wrong. And maybe there are enough ways to do that, but right now I'm not really seeing it. I hope this Return to Clockwork City gives us more ways to abuse Basilisk, because I do think it would be a very cool card to see in constructed play, along with cards. I think it kind of forces you into Warrior. At least that's my first inclination. Cards like Rapid Shot and Skaven Pyromancer. But one of the problems is you could easily turn 1 Grim Patron into 4 on a single turn with only like 6 mana in Hearthstone. And for this card only being 3 magic in this game, that's definitely good, but we don't have quite the level of the ping effects that Hearthstone has. We don't have the Inner Rages or the Whirlwinds, which would make this card truly great. We have Rapid Shot, we have Skaven Pyromancer, but another problem is that once Basilisk is taking 1 point of damage, unless you've buffed its health, you can no longer get any more Basilisk out of the first one, and then you have to sort of get it out of the second one. So right now I'm seeing sort of a slow deck that like probably doesn't have enough viability to really dedicate the whole deck to the combo with a bunch of card draw, cycle, and pings like Patron Warrior did, but maybe in the future we can get there. Cards like Enchanted Plate also speak to me as would be obviously good with Basilisk. You're buffing the health and you're drawing some cards so you can draw into more of your cards like Rapid Shot, which would also be fantastic for the strategy. I don't know if the power level of this card, even when it goes off, is really going to be that high in this game, but this is a card that could definitely surprise us, I think. I want it to be better than it looks on first glance, but again, this is one of those cards that really requires us to know more of the expansion, I think. But definitely really sweet card design, one of my favorite cards revealed so far. The final card in today's video is Nyx Hound Fabricant. So this is part of the 5-card cycle of Fabricants. We've seen a couple in the first impressions video, number 1, you can check that out, the purple and the yellow ones. This is the green one, and it has 3/3 for 4 Magicka, Drain, and Summon if you have a neutral card in play, shackle an enemy creature. All of this this cycle of cards, I think there's going to be one of each of them, in one in each attribute, and they have the Summon if you have a neutral card in play, do X basically. The purple one turned into an 8/8 basically for 5. This one is, I think, a bit more interesting than the 2 that were previewed so far, and not so sure about how it stands in reference to power level compared to the other 2, but I think this one is interesting because it shows that they're not just going for stats. The other 2 cards, one summoned a copy of itself, the other turned into an 8/8 like I mentioned. Very simple, straightforward, curve-based stat effects, and this one is cool because it actually has utility. It's a card with Drain and shackling. So people have already mentioned like Shackle Assassin or whatever, but I just think this card is interesting because it's a bit more defensive. You can use it to race because you can shackle something that's pressuring you, and then you can start hitting for 3 with Drain. Drain is really powerful. I think people underestimate that still a lot. I'm not so sure about how it would fit into a mostly neutral deck if you're going to be playing that, but I think these Fabricants, more so than the other cards we've talked about, really do require us to know more about the set to really know how they're going to sit in terms of power level. It's just really important to know how good our deck is going to be if we pack it full of neutral creatures. But I do think this card is potentially good if those kind of decks are good. I like Drain on this kind of thing, and shackling an enemy creature, never really bad. You never really hate having shackle on top of something, and it has Drain regardless. Even if you don't play this when you already have a neutral card in play, you're still at least playing a 4-cost 3/3 with Drain, which is kind of comparable to a Moonlight Werebat that you play without Prophecy. So already I'm not hating the card, and it could actively be pretty amazing if decks that play that many neutral creatures are good and want to play agility as well. These are just my first thoughts. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video. As always, if you did, feel free to leave a like and stay subscribed for more Legends content. If you have an opinion about any of the cards that we went over today, feel free to leave a comment, join the conversation, and let me know what you think and what you're excited to see in Return to Clockwork City. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.